welcome to MyCounselor.Online. I'm Tori, and today I'm sitting down with one of our counselors here. This is Kashina Harris, and we're going to talk through her article, Married, Lonely, and Desperate, Learning to Reconnect with Your Spouse. I'm super excited to just talk through this article, kind of get a little more insight from her. And so I'm going to jump right into my first question after reading the article. I would love to know if you could emphasize on the war zone that you describe. You give an example of marriage in one couple's case being like a war zone. So I'd love it if you could just emphasize on that and what it means.
The war zone that I refer to in the article is really that moment in your marriage where you feel like everything that has kind of accumulated over time, just the miscommunication, the loneliness and the hopelessness that you guys have experienced have kind of reached this point to where you guys are both coming together, just very opposite viewpoints on the topic, and you guys are really trying to communicate your wants and your desires and your needs, and you're really trying to communicate that with the other person. And so the war zone is something that has been building for a while, and then you have this conflict that takes place. And so in that conflict, it's really difficult because there's a lot of things happening for each person there that really is so they feel really strongly about. And when we're in that conflict, things can get missed. And things can get miscommunicated. And so kind of like a war zone is very, you have to watch your step. You have to be very careful. Although I've never been in a war zone, I'm picturing that's what it would be like. That you're really kind of bracing yourself for something to go worse, to go wrong. And so when you're in that conflict with your spouse, or maybe in another in a conflict with somebody else, even you're kind of bracing yourself, like, I'm going to tell this person my side, but then you're bracing yourself and kind of being very careful about not sharing too much, not being too vulnerable, because that comes at a risk.
No, I think of like my own marriage and those moments, those war zone moments, where just the conflict is so intense, and you're, coming together in marriage, two broken people, two, messy stories, and trying to like find that middle ground. And it can feel very like war zone-ish.
Yeah. And that's a great point that you brought up, is that, it's not always this fight between flesh and blood. And so a lot of times there's a spiritual realm there too, that we are fighting in those situations. So that war zone has a really strong meaning, but it's just meant because there's a lot of strong emotions and feelings and desires happening in that moment that we really can't unpack when we have reached that point of conflict.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And, you mentioned multiple things throughout the article that I just think are really profound and really important. One of the things that you mentioned is that vulnerability comes at the cost of uncertainty. And I just would love it if you could talk more about this and what it means.
So vulnerability really allows us to take a look at not what's happening in our relationships with other people, but really it allows us to take a step back and really evaluate what's happening within ourselves. And if we can do that, if we can take a step back and we can evaluate what is really happening within ourselves and identify some of those emotions that we're having, then it's going to be easier to be vulnerable with somebody. So when we step into that vulnerability phase, it's kind of taking what we've done, that reflection, and just the introspect that we have of ourselves, and we are putting it kind of in a place where our spouse or the other person in the relationship can do something with it, right? So we're giving them our emotions, we're giving them our feelings, we're giving them our desires and our wants. And so the risk there that really happens is they could do nothing with it. They could really not acknowledge those feelings. They could walk away from them. They could be destructive with those feelings. And so obviously our hope is that they would take what we're saying and our emotions, and they would take care of those, and they would eventually lay a path for a relationship where vulnerability was accepted, and it was a piece that that would offer growth. But there's just a risk there. It's like planting a garden and not knowing really what it will produce. You put a lot of time and effort into it, but then you just hope for the best and hope for the right fruit.
You describe that as one of the weapons that can be used, in order to connect with your spouse. And you mentioned several, weapons, several suggestions for connecting with your spouse. So what, I guess, makes those suggestions really actionable steps?
So the weapons we discuss are really not weapons necessarily, but kind of going back to the theme of like this kind of being like a war zone. And sometimes this war zone is kind of silent. It's really what's happening within ourselves and really in private. So other people around us may not even know what's happening. That's kind of the lonely piece, that we can show up at church, or we could show up to our friends or our family, and they really have no idea that we are fighting this battle in our marriages and within ourselves. And so these weapons are really just put in place to offer some direction. So vulnerability is definitely one of the weapons we can use to connect with our spouse, because I think that's what's missing in those moments when we are in this war zone and we are trying to be vulnerable. Is we're trying to connect. We're trying to, which is kind of how we were created. Like God created us to connect with people and to feel connected. And so in our marriages, when we have a disconnect, the way to connect again with our spouse is to be vulnerable and share those hard feelings and emotions that put us at risk. And then there are really other weapons that we can have on hand that are helpful. And so I mentioned a few of those in the paper. And because I am a mom and because I read a lot, I use the titles that are kind of slightly cheesy, but really stick in my mind. So the first one I talk about is the heading is just like, let it all hang out. And so that kind of goes back to that vulnerability piece of just being uncomfortable. And so I just let it all hang out was a little bit uncomfortable for me to even type. And so almost like being vulnerable with your spouse, like this is going to feel uncomfortable, but it's going to be hopefully helpful.
Right. Kind of just like taking off the mask. Like this is actually what it is. And that can be risky for the spouse and for yourself.
Right. And somehow there's healing in that for you too, even if the other person doesn't receive it well, that you can actually formulate words and feelings around what's happening inside. And so I think that's just such a great depiction of of just letting it hang out and being real and taking the mask off. Like you said, that's such a really neat way of just visualizing that. The second little title is extra, read all about it. And so with that title, I just wanted to say, do your homework. Just don't settle for this is just a war zone and we keep having the same arguments and disagreements, but by being vulnerable and then just reading and doing your homework and reaching out to a counselor, and then also just study your spouse. That's something that we miss out on a lot, is we really get caught up in just what everybody else is saying and all of the weapons that we are given. But study your spouse with passion and listen to them. Give them a space to where when they are vulnerable, they feel like they can take that risk with you.
I love that. I love that because I think a lot of times we get into this mindset of we got married, I know him, I know that person, I don't really need to study them anymore. But we're always learning, we're always growing.
Yeah, and so studying your spouse can really be helpful, and just knowing what direction to go. And also, in marriage, like, you don't really plan on things being difficult, or as difficult as they can be in some situations. And so not all pain is bad. And so some pain promotes us to change. And so one of the quotes that I put in the paper that I think just really sums everything up nice um, is from the book Boundaries by Henry McLeod and James Townsend. And it says, "We change our behavior when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of change." And so I think that's just a really good depiction of what happens in marriages.
Yeah. So all of those steps that you mentioned throughout the article, those weapons, is there ever a time, Kashina, where those are not needed anymore?
So the weapons we discuss in the article, they're really to promote growth in your marriage and to find a way for you and your spouse to really connect on a deeper level. And so those weapons that I discuss in the article, they're not really an as needed accessory for your marriage, but really they force our emotions into action. So my goal in the article is really just to communicate and with couples who are in this stage of their marriage, that this is common. Like, this is something that marriages and relationships go through. Times where they feel disconnected and they feel lonely, and it really feels like a desperate place for them. And just to have that as something that they know they're not alone in, but also to give them steps that will hopefully promote growth and a deeper connection with their spouse.